So let's start with a definition. When I talk about bias, can I hear bias? Ooh, my morning people are with me today. I'm talking about reaching conclusions. So I have reached a conclusion about someone or a group of people in a way that is preconceived. I have given birth to an idea of who a person is. I have filled in that missing information with assumptions. I haven't taken the time to weigh evidence of who they are. And I am assuming that what was true about people I've encountered of this identity group is going to be true for you. So bias, reaching a conclusion in favor or against someone in a way that is preconceived, unreasoned, and assumptive. When we look at bias, we can actually break it down even further. Can I hear a break it down? You can break it down into explicit bias and implicit bias. And the difference between explicit bias and implicit bias is the level of awareness that I have of this preconceived notion of who people are. Explicit bias means that I am aware that I am this way. I am aware of who I am and who I want to be, and I behave in a certain way that shows that and demonstrates that. What is an example? Maybe hate speech. Maybe a symbol that signals and communicates hate. And then we have this implicit bias that starts to form when I'm not aware of it, below the level of consciousness. Social scientists divide implicit bias into implicit prejudice. Prejudice is an attitude. It is a feeling. So you might see somebody or see something and you feel a certain way. And your feelings are telling on you because it reveals what the bias is. And you walk it back and you can find the source. And also implicit stereotypes, where you assign a character or a personality trait to an individual without getting to know who they are. So implicit prejudice, feelings, you feel a certain way. Implicit stereotyping, you believe a certain thing about the person or thing you are looking at. This is all well and good. I started to ask myself the question, but why do we have bias in the first place? Why does it exist in the first place? You see, the brain predicts. It uses your previous experience and applies what you have learned, what you've experienced in the past to new situations as well. It uses the senses in the environment. That's why sight and sound are huge triggers for those biases, for those networks, for those representations. And as a result, the brain relies on that in order to maximize rewards and keep you safe. And so some researchers were very interested in this notion of bias. And so they started to look at 4.4 million tests on bias. And they started to do a longitudinal study where they tracked bias from year 1 to year 13. And they started to ask the question about whether bias was increasing in society or decreasing in society. And so I would like you to predict. Your brain loves to fill in missing information, so predict with me. What do they find? Get out your cell phones if you can and predict with me. What did this study find? What do you think the outcome of the test show? Was bias increasing? Is bias decreasing? Is bias staying the same? What do you think, audience? Many are saying that the outcome of the tests, 4.4 million bias tests over the course of 13 years, showed that bias is decreasing in our society. explicit and implicit bias is on the decline. But before we pause and we celebrate, it's because we start to exist in a more multicultural society. However, when you look at other research, people say 6 in 10 people in this country say that race relations have not gotten better in this country. So implicit and explicit bias is decreasing. But people are saying that things are not changing. And I recognize that you can measure progress in 2 ways. What happened in the past compared to now, and what happened now compared to what the ideal is. A lot of people are in this camp saying, we are not where we need to be. Harvard psychologist Elizabeth Phelps did an experiment where she brought people into her lab and they filled out questionnaires to gauge their explicit bias levels, and then they took a test to gauge their implicit bias, and they hooked up electrodes to these individuals to start to see how they react to black and white faces. And they saw that it didn't match up. People were not explicitly biased, but people did show implicit bias. And even though bias is on the decline, there is a gap. There is a gap in action. There is a gap in behavior. And that is why we are here today. We're here to figure out, how do we bridge the gap? How do we start to close the space between us? And so, Forscher in 2019 published a meta-review. So they took 492 studies on implicit bias, over 80,000 people, and they started to look at what interventions are actually working. What types of things do people need to do to bridge the gap between what they feel in their spirits and their hearts and start to act a little more? And so why don't you get out your phones and let's guess what they thought. Let's guess what they found. So they looked at exposing yourself to counter-stereotype examples compared to making anti-bias training mandatory. Which one was more effective in your mind? So yes, they found that exposure to counter-stereotype examples, exposure to perspective taking was more effective than making training mandatory, from having consequences available for showing certain behavior. It's because these counter-stereotype examples they found are weakening your associations. They are reframing your associations. They are building new neural networks that will be accessed when you see something, when you hear something, when you smell something, when you taste something, when you touch something. And so they say the intervention that needs to happen is you need to attack the associations that you have made explicitly or implicitly. Let's go to the next one. They said, affirming people by giving them feedback about being unbiased. You're a great person, you show anti-biased behavior, or making a culture of inclusion a core value of an organization. Which one was more effective? Absolutely. They found that when an organizational culture embodies goals and values, it allows people to recognize that they are not just behaving in a way that is good for them, but this is an organizational cloak that I wear, and this is an expectation of who I need to be within this organization.